I don't see it, but okay, that's fine.
Can you see it now?
I see Chris's face. A little dime in the middle of Chris's face, so to speak, or half dollar, whatever it is, size. Not sure why. I can log out and come back in.
Okay. Can anyone else see it? Chris, can you still see it?
Yeah, I see the Biblical Flood, Oklahoma City School of Biblical Studies.
Let's go out and come back in if you would. All right.
Yes, sir. Problem's got to be me. Please proceed. I've got something to fix here. I'm not sure why it's acting funny.
Okay, can you just try to come back in? I'll start. Okay.
Okay.
Start. Okay. This is lesson 54, and on the study of the biblical flood. And I'm getting this out of my second edition of my book, which has not been printed. Much of this material is also in the first edition of the book, however. We're looking at atheistic interpretation errors, the errors that atheists make in interpretation. We're going to look at, first of all, some reasons for atheistic errors in interpretation. And one of the reasons is everybody has a worldview, it's called. That's a term used in philosophy. That's how you view things. And the atheistic worldview is materialism. That is, everything is material. We are just atoms and electrons, protons and neutrons. That's all we are. And there's no such thing as a soul or a spirit. And so scientific materialism is a philosophical position that claims that the material world is the only reality. So the only thing that's real is physical things. And that's the view of materialism, scientific materialism. Brancazio, and this is out of a science journal, a reputable journal I'm quoting here. Brancazio, page 894. From this worldview, the atheist cannot accept any theistic interpretation, no matter how rational it might be, because his whole line of thinking is this cannot be, there's no God. And so he won't entertain any thoughts, and he won't even consider them that would support theism. Theism, a belief in God, the idea that God exists. If he begins with that view in mind, he won't entertain the view. He'll find a way around or to explain these, to explain the arguments and the points that are made to support theism. There are a number of instances in which the atheists have jumped to wrong conclusions, such as Java Man, Nebraska Man, and Piltdown Man. All of these have been refuted. And even the atheists themselves have rejected these things. So they jumped to these conclusions because they thought they were proving their atheistic viewpoint. That is, that organic macroevolution occurs. Remember, if atheism is true, there has to be a way to explain the existence of life. Atheists, and of course, all they have is evolution, a macroevolution. Atheists tend to ignore evidence that is contrary to their worldview. Now, I want to make a point of this. Sometimes we can do that too if we're not careful. So we need to be very careful we don't do that. Here's a quote now. And again, I think it's Brancazio. In the course of normal science, experiments or observations may reveal anomalies. Now, anomaly is from a Greek word, nomos logo, and alpha privative, which means something that doesn't go by the standard law that we're using or that we think exists, or conflicts with the prevailing theory of things. At first, anomalies are ignored or allowed to go unexplained. They just ignore them or gloss over them. their assumption is that we just don't have enough evidence to answer this, but there is an answer. And so that's what they assume. But if they're sufficiently troublesome, an ad hoc hypothesis may be proposed that adjusts the theory so as to preserve it. So they'll make an adjustment in their theory so that they can preserve the theory, to keep the theory. And so that's what he tells us here. A significant number of anomalies may cause the validity of a theory into question, call it into question. So it may make it where there's a good reason to question it. But there must be a competing theory available before a scientific revolution takes place. Now, keep this in mind. This is Brancazio, and this is certainly the case. He's being very candid and very open about this. There has to be a competing theory. Now, again, if you are locked into the mindset of being an atheist, you cannot even entertain a theory, an explanation that would be theistic. And so you are locked out of that. You haven't given that an opportunity to be even considered. And so that's part of the problem here. So again, if he's a bona fide atheist, he won't even entertain the idea, or he might not entertain the idea of theistic explanation. The ignoring of conflicting information is admitted to be a common practice. It is common. And it's reasonable that they would not understand everything because we don't have infinite knowledge. We're not omniscient. And that's not within itself a bad thing, but it is a bad thing to reject evidence without considering the possibility of it being true. This has been done in a number of areas, and we'll be looking at those. It's common in areas which conflict with the atheistic worldview: the age of the universe, the age of the solar system, the age of the earth, the beginning of life, and such things as that. Evidence for the biblical flood and things of that nature. So they rejected. Now we continue. This is another quote. Modern day cosmology. Now cosmology is the explanation of how things came into existence. So how did the universe come into existence, the cosmos come into existence? Theology is from logos, and cosmos is the arrangement of things, and ology is the sayings regarding it. So how do we explain the existence of the cosmos, the sun, moon, and stars, and the earth, and so forth? With its big cosmology, with its Big Bang paradigm is an explanation or a set of boundaries by which you're going to explain something. It's particularly enlightening because of the existence of significant anomalies. So now he's going to give you an example of some anomalies, namely the missing mass problem. There's not enough mass that they found in the universe, not even near enough, not even close to being enough mass to explain the Big Bang theory. So what they do is they have an ad hoc hypothesis of dark matter. There's matter that we cannot see. We call it dark matter. It has to be there because the Big Bang occurred, see? And so we can't have the Big Bang without this matter, so the matter must be there, we just haven't found it. That's their reasoning. And the discordant redshifts discovered by Halt and Arp. And redshifts that have occurred as it moved outward. And so as it accelerates away from where the explosion occurred, the Big Bang occurred, we should get a redshift, a shift in the red direction. That is a lower frequency or a higher wavelength, a shorter wavelength, lower frequency, a longer wavelength. It shifts in the direction of the red light. Blue shift would be moving toward us, and red shift would be moving away from us. I find it very interesting that most of what they find is in the red shift, and mostly red shift And that would fit if we're near the center of where the Big Bang occurred. Let's assume it did occur. But anyhow, this was discovered by Halton Arp, and they've largely ignored what he found. And they threatened the validity of Hubble's law, which we talked about Hubble's law earlier in our study. His point, and he says, now we have this problem with it. We have discordant redshift. We don't have enough matter, the dark matter hypothesis. At this point, there's no reasonable alternative to Big Bang cosmology. Well, we can't entertain the idea that it was created by God because we don't believe in God, see. So there's no imminent likelihood of a scientific revolution. In additional anomalies that may turn up will probably continue to be dealt with in an ad hoc manner. We just ad hoc, before we even see the evidence, we just draw a conclusion. We can't find this dark matter, but we know Big Bang occurred, therefore it has to be there. This discordant redshift that Halton Arp has found, we know that's there. We know that exists, but since the Big Bang occurred, there must be another explanation to explain it. That's what we mean by ad hoc. That's a Latin term, before the fact. I appreciate the candor of the writer, Brancazio, because it reveals what actually happens in the scientific community. So we do have a problem with them, and this is one of the things that we see occurring. Atheistic scientists will claim that either the laws of science do not or did not apply to a given situation, or that there's some unknown factors. The anomaly is a special case, for example, what's explaining the phenomenon. Special case such as there's dark matter, we just hadn't found it. And there is an explanation for the redshift anomaly that Harp found. This is what has occurred with the dark matter and ignoring of other facts. That's what's happened. Atheists, and I admit I have biases. Atheists are biased from time to time by their own preconceived ideas, just as any person, including myself, is prone to be biased. We have to be very careful that we don't let our biases override our clear thinking and our examination of the evidence. We need to be careful that we're honest truth seekers. That's important that we be honest, and we be truth seekers. It seems to me, here's another quote, and it's another source, another quote and this is in my book as well. It seems to me that there can be a great deal at stake, especially if we are working on a scientific dating method, which will be used to test or underpin historically derived chronology. So now we're going to try to date things by some scientific method. Let us not forget that the ice core scientists first produced a date for the theory eruption of 1390 plus or minus 50 years BC. This was hailed as compatible with the then Egyptian-style pottery chronology. And following the publication of reliable calibrated radiocarbon dates, the ice core scientists actually repudiated 1390 and came up with 1645 plus or minus BC. A date later claimed to be compatible with the frost signature date of 1628 to 1626 in that range. Neither the second date nor its compatibility with the frost signature date are now typically accepted. So they changed it and say they used frost compatibility date, and they redated it with the frost signature date. And then now they've decided both of them are wrong. That's what Neugroth says here. So they keep readjusting it. And so each system then they find that flaws in their system. And they go with one another. An excellent example of the attitude of atheists dealing with the evidence which might contradict their atheistic worldview is the statements made by Engels, page 14. We're going to see it here in a quote now. This is a quote by Engels. This is most interesting. I find this very interesting. A number of footprints appear in rock on sites reaching from Virginia and Pennsylvania to Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and westward toward the Rocky Mountains. Prints, several of those shown above, and there's a picture of some, are from 5 to 10 inches long, have from time to time been found on the surface of exposed rocks, and more keep turning up as the years go by. So these look like human footprints is what they look like. They look like human footprints. They're found in rocks of the Carboniferous period, and these rocks were laid down about 250 million years ago. So they've dated these rocks by their dating system at 250 million years. Then they say, the scientists exclaim, what? You want man in the Carboniferous? Entirely and absolutely, totally and completely impossible. Why? Because it doesn't fit our system of organic macroevolution. We admit we don't know exactly what made the prints, but we do know one agency that did, and that is man in the Carboniferous. See, so what they've done here is they just completely rejected any possibility, because they've dated this at 250 million years ago, and they've dated the evolution of man at a few million years. Okay, so that's what they dated. And so their dating system caused them to totally reject any possibility this may be human footprints. The atheist says a priori, before the facts, prior to examining the evidence, determined that man could not have been a contemporary of the dinosaurs, when the footprints show evidence that they were. Another problem with science is that many conclusions are based on assumptions. You must remember that when they're looking at this information, it's not science. Why? Because science has to actually see it occur. They're looking at evidence, and it's a system of faith. And again, we get back to how we know things in our earlier lessons. It's very important that we kind of keep our mind squared away. They'll call this science, but it's not really science. If science is empirical knowledge, things that you observe in either with your eyes, or you heard it, you've seen it, you heard it, you've tasted it, you've touched it, or you smelled it, one of your 5 senses. This is not something that came in the empirical method. Therefore, it's not true science by their definition of what science is. But they'll call it science, and in order to make it sound good. Others are merely a choice of several possible explanations of the phenomena being observed. So the question is, we see these tracks. They look like human footprints, but they can't be, because man and the dinosaurs of that time period, we've dated that rock at 250 million years, and we've dated the evolution of man at maybe 1 million years ago or so, 500,000 years ago. And so they just can't be, this can't be human footprints. It's something else. We don't know what it is, but it's something else. Oldfield discusses the problem with regard to environmental magnetism. And so here he says, the very sensitivity of magnetic minerals, as well as the precursors of diagenic successors to such a vast range of environmental processes, often leaves open a wide spectrum of possible explanations of the magnetic variations observed. Now, of course, part of their dating technique is they claim that the Earth's magnetic field is collapsing, and that it cycles, it reverses itself every certain amount of period of time. And of course, now then, we've already pointed out that from a mathematical standpoint, they claim that it reverses and it's decaying in a linear fashion. If it's decaying in a linear fashion, then we got a problem, because a linear decay from Fourier, F-O-U-R-I-E-R, Fourier analysis of mathematics, it should generate a series of harmonics of cycles in the magnetic field. They should reverse themselves in a cyclic manner. And so we got a problem with the whole system. And we would have to use Fourier analysis to figure out where these would be. And so if we have these, let's assume they're right, that it does decay linearly instead of exponentially, which I doubt. But let's assume they're right just for the sake of argument. there should be harmonics generated, a reversal of magnetic fields on a harmonic basis. And so they should reverse due to this movement. And that's a problem with their whole system. Most of these guys that have come up with this theory don't have the mathematical background to analyze that. Probably, I would guess. That's my guess. Most of your geologists haven't taken advanced mathematics and probably would not understand anything about Fourier analysis. But Fourier analysis definitely works in the mechanical, hydraulic, electrical, and electronic realm and magnetic realm. It works, and it happens. I've seen it in all kinds of experiments performed and set up. True science will consider all the possibilities rather than reject a priori or before the fact without evidence one or more of the possible options. So we won't just reject it because we've got this bias ahead. The atheist has rejected the evidence for the existence of God without considering it in many instances. You just haven't, a priori, they've rejected it before they've seen the evidence, prior to ever seeing the facts. I've encountered many instances in reading scientific literature where the writer says something like, well, this must be the answer to the problem since the universe is over 4 billion years old. That's what we just saw in our earlier quote about the footprints. And it wasn't 4 billion, but it was not, it was several hundred million. Eddie and Bornosian believe the sun has been shrinking for 100 years, perhaps 400 years or more. They believe that because the rate is so fast, at this rate, sun would shrink to zero radius in 200,000 years. Shrinking is temporary. They believe it's temporary because it would shrink to zero radius in 200,000 years, and that does not apply to the entire solar mass. Can't be because we know it's the Earth's 4.5 billion years old. The sun's even older than that. So it should have, if it's going to shrink to zero radius in 200,000, it couldn't have happened because the sun's much, much older than that, see. So they've already assumed the age of the sun. And so this cannot be used by them to date the age of the sun. Noise told us that the shrinkage must be transitory because we would have already seen geological evidence of any long-term contraction. See, we've already seen it. And if you project backwards, the Earth's 4 billion years old, project that shrinkage backwards in time, the Earth in just a few million years would have been inside the sun itself. Of course, it would have been burned up, being that close to the sun, being actually inside the sun. Noise is saying the Earth's 4.5 billion years old. It would have melted only about 1 million years ago at the rate. It says the sun is shrinking. If you reverse it, the shrinkage backwards in time, the Earth would have been inside the sun 1 million years ago. Therefore, it could not have been shrinking at this rate since its beginning. That's what he's claiming. And so you can't use this to argue for a young sun based upon this, because they've already ahead of time assumed the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, see, and the sun is older than the Earth, of course. This began with this bias, their atheistic worldview, which includes several assumptions. First assumption, the Earth's billions of years old, usually around 4.5 billion years old. I think macroevolutionism, magnetism explains the existence of living organisms, and there's no purpose for the existence of anything. And of course, then the sun is older than the Earth itself. The universe is older, maybe around 15 billion years old, approximately thereabouts. So those are assumptions they begin with. And all of their data has to be massaged or interpreted within that realm, or within that area of information, within that paradigm. Kemp stated, before the early 1970s, most paleontologists interpreted their fossil record in the light of the prevailing view of evolution works. the Neo-Darwinian or synthetic theory. And so they rejected the mechanism that Darwin chose and postulated, and his mechanism, they completely rejected his mechanism. So they got a new system, Neo-Darwinism. Neo from Neos in Greek is new Darwinism. The fact that the fossil data did not on the whole seem to fit this prevailing model of the process of evolution, for example, the absence of intermediate forms and of gradually changing lineages over millions of years, readily explained by the notorious incompleteness of the fossil record. So I said it's a notorious thing that we can't find the intermediate fossils, we can't find the gradually changing lineages and fossils evolving. And so we don't find them. And that's a notorious incompleteness of the fossil record that they've disappeared, say. In other words, when the assumed evolutionary process did not match the pattern of the fossils that they were supposed to have generated, the pattern was judged to be wrong. The pattern is wrong because we know evolution occurred. It's there, we just didn't find it. A circular argument arises, interprets the fossil record in terms of a particular theory of evolution. Inspect the interpretation, notes that it confirms the theory. Well, it would, wouldn't it? He admits it. As is now well known, most fossil species appear instantaneously in the record, persist for some millions of years, virtually unchanged, only disappear abruptly. That's what he admits. This is an admission. That's exactly what we see. Now, what we ask is, this abrupt disappearance of species is exactly what we expected from the flood model. Exactly what we'd expect. The abrupt disappearance of species, exactly what we expected from the flood model. The bias, or this bias that the Earth is approximately 4 billion years old, is demonstrated by Incarnaz et al. In their discussion of the excess internal energy of 3 of the Jovian planets. Now, your Jovian planets would be Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Those 4 are called the Jovian planets. 3 of those planets actually give off more light than they take in. They're not just reflectors of light. Now, our moon reflects light, but Jupiter actually gives off quite a lot more light than it actually is coming from the sun and the other stars. So it's not just a reflector, it's actually a source of energy, a source of light. But 3 of the Jovian planets are. And here's a discussion of this. In the first case, an estimate of the time required for a planet to cool may be obtained knowing the current energy excess, L. We would then obtain the simple result, tau, is mCV over 4L. But this model, to be plausible, the value of tau found by calculation must be of the same order as the age of the solar system. So we have to plug in the age of the solar system into this. That'd be 5 times 10 to the 9th. That'd be 5 billion years. So they plug it into their model here, and they get this view. So they're saying that we are getting light from these 3 of the Jovian planets, which are largely gaseous planets, and due to gravitational contraction, as the gases, gravity pulls them tighter in, they have to give off energy from the change of potential energy, it's called in physics. That is, as it moves closer to the center, it has to give up energy. That energy would come out in the form of light. Incarnaz et al. And the others with him wrote this article. Will not consider a model that contradicts the worldview that the solar system is 5 billion years old. They won't consider a model where it's less than a few thousand years old. Some atheists seem to set out to prove their theories rather than following the evidence in their search for truth. I think it's entirely possible that we may have had that Jupiter, for example, may have been a source of light on the early Earth. It may have been a factor somehow, because it may have actually been as bright as the moon or brighter. There's some evidence that may be the case, okay? And it's getting its energy almost certainly from gravitational contraction. And of course, the theory is that the sun is. Now, of course, the problem with the sun is they're claiming it's also getting energy from nuclear fusion. That's the process by which a hydrogen bomb works. Fission is the splitting of an atom. Fusion is the putting together of two atoms into another atom, into another element. In this case, hydrogen, two hydrogen atoms become a helium atom. These atheists are not true scientists because they're not searching for truths. They're trying to justify their theories. Don Prothero stated during the 1950s, biochemists, we're looking at biochemists now, developed a theory for the origin of life that had a profound influence on geological thinking ever since. So they come up with a theory for life. That theory required an oxygen-free or anaerobic is no aerobic, no oxygen, ocean and atmosphere. The reason it is because oxygen tends to kill things. And so we see a problem with it, evolution occurring if there's a lot of free oxygen and O2 in the atmosphere, lots of it. Limited experimental results seem to confirm the inference that complex protein molecules could not have formed if free molecular oxygen, O2, and that's basically oxygen that we breathe, existed at the Earth's surface. So you just couldn't get it. The chemistry wouldn't allow it to occur. Naturally, the biochemists then ask if the geologic record supported their apparent requirement. And geologists quickly asserted, yes, indeed, Archean, that means old rocks, bear evidence of anaerobic early conditions. Both chemists and geologists then hypothesize how our present oxygen-rich or anaerobic atmosphere might have developed slowly. So it developed slowly, according to their theory. And geologic evidence cited for Archean anaerobic conditions, that's ancient, may not stand up well to critical scrutiny. In hindsight, now notice this, what he says suggests that perhaps the geologists found what the biochemists wanted. They found what was necessary for their worldview to be true. If the atheists found what the atheistic model demanded in this instance, it is possible that they have found it in other instances as well. I put found in quotes there. Aware of that. The arguments advanced for the biblical flood have not been rejected because they're not substantive, but because they're theistic. That's why they rejected them. Now, Shea tells us, again, all of this is in the book, and you have the book, electronic copy of it, that is. Uniformitarianism. Now, notice we've back to uniformitarianism again. Uniformitarianism guides us in developing and choosing among substantive hypotheses, but the principle itself asserts nothing about nature and is therefore not subject to verification or testing. We can't verify whether uniformitarianism is true. This is the view that all things have occurred very slowly over time in a uniform process. The geologists have already rejected uniformitarianism, and it caused a real uproar whenever they introduced catastrophic views. We've already seen that in some of our very early lessons in this series. The atheist may have several hypotheses that are substantive, that is, have substance to them, but he will accept one of them because he's guided by uniformitarianism, as we saw here on page 7 of this notes. Merriam-Webster defines substantive as having or expressing substance. So we may have several substantive systems or explanations, but they'll reject any of them that aren't atheistic. If it's theistic in view, they automatically reject it. The atheist has not rejected the biblical flood because the evidence contradicts it, because there's no substance for it, but because it contradicts his worldview, which is atheistic materialism. This overlooks the evidence against the atheistic explanation and clings to his theory because he cannot or will not consider the alternative, which is theism. Ropp discusses several areas in which creationists are misrepresented under the heading Arguments Not Made by Creationists, pages 17 through 19. This is, I think his name is David Robb. Either the atheist misrepresents the creationists ignorantly or they're guilty of deceit. Now, when they make arguments and they supposedly set forth arguments that putting them in the mouth of the creationists, they're either ignorant and making claims that creationists believe such and such, or they're guilty of deceiving. If they're ignorant, then they're unqualified to discuss the issue. They're not qualified to be even discussing it. They need to inform themselves of exactly what creationists do teach. If they're dishonest and misrepresenting their opponents, then they're unworthy of an audience. They're not even worthy to be listened to. Either way, they're either ignorant or dishonest when they use arguments in lower level textbooks that know or should know are unsound. And that's the problem we get into. This gets to their credibility. They have no credibility when they do that. Robb claims that creationists misunderstood the present day views of the atheistic geologists. Here's what he said, David Robb. The misunderstanding has been caused in part by geologists themselves. The 19th century idea of uniformitarianism and gradualism still exists in popular treatments of geology, some museum exhibits and lower level textbooks. All right. So the 19th century idea of uniformitarianism and gradualism, which they have rejected, see, but they still have it in the museum exhibits, and there's popular treatments of geology and the lower level textbooks. It is even still taught in secondary school classrooms, and one can hardly blame the creationists for having the idea that the conventional wisdom in geology is still a non-catastrophic one. But Robb admits catastrophism is the explanation. In other words, uniformitarianism, gradualism is not accepted, but yet they still put it in their textbooks. This problem of unsound arguments being used in textbooks is noted by other authorities cited in this treatise. I would ask you a simple question. The fact that this error is still perpetrated in secondary schools gives Christians a good reason to combat it. If the atheistic case is as strong as they claim, why do they resort to using unsound arguments in these textbooks? Why don't they have a sound argument? Is it because they don't have one? The atheist asserts that the earth is 4.5 billion years old so frequently and with such confidence, it makes one wonder if the atheist knows something the theist does not know. But it's just a claim. I was told when I was studying that course in logic and debate, argumentation and debate was the title of the course. I was told of a speaker who was attempting to persuade an audience that he wrote in his notes, weak points, speak loudly and pound on the podium. So you got a weak point, so speak real loud and pound on the podium. We should ask himself if the atheist has even offered a proof of his assertion, or is he just pounding on the podium? I think they're just pounding on the podium when we look at it. If a lie is told confidently and frequently enough, it will be accepted by many people. That's the case. That's true. Let me summarize. The lesson will be yours. The atheistic worldview blinds some scientists to the truth. Cling to uniformitarianism, and yet their arguments, they've rejected uniformitarianism, but they use uniformitarian arguments in their dating and other things. And of course, it's all interlocked. They have to have organic evolution, macroevolution to occur. They assume it occurred. Then they use that assumption to prove that it occurred. It's by circular reasoning. They engage in circular reasoning over and over. And they use uniformitarianism and gradualism, which they rejected. And they're dishonest in their using it in high school books. Why are they using it there? Because they don't have an argument. They don't have a good argument to prove their case. And they call something science when it's not science. Now, true science is empirical. And they call things science when it's not. So they say this is scientific when it's not scientific at all. Because if they didn't observe it, it's not true science. That's the problem. Again, they equivocate, they change the meaning of the word science. In some times they'll use it as empirical knowledge, derived by empirical meaning, by the senses. Then they'll turn around and they'll call something science that they know was not derived by the senses, out of the five senses, any of the five senses. And again, I see dishonesty here is what I see. And I think that they just do not want to believe in God. And we see this problem in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through the end of the chapter, verse 32. This concludes our study for tonight. And we will go and stop the recording.